Of today's presentation, Iron Men and Tin Fish, the story of Fremantle's secret fleets 1942 to 1945. This quote up on the screen, unheard they work, unseen they win, that is the custom of the trade. As you might recall, in the First World War, some of the senior admirals considered the submariners to be tradesmen, and they immediately took up the title and called their enterprise of the trade. These words were by Rudyard Kipling in his book Sea Warfare during the First World War, when he had the advantage of actually going to sea in submarines and ships. But his words there, particularly those last ones, unseen they win, describe perfectly the whole episode of the part played by the Fremantle and Albany submarine bases in the Pacific War, a time when some 165 United States, Dutch and British submarines operated from those bases from 1942 to 1945. Although the bases were small and the fleets were small when compared to Pearl Harbor, the Fremantle base accounted for more than half of the Japanese tanker losses. And of course you'll be aware that the tankers were the lifeblood of the Imperial Japanese war machine. So the relentless campaign carried out against them from Fremantle can't be underestimated in the successful outcome of the Pacific War. But, strangely, the existence of the Allied submarine operation from Fremantle isn't widely known. I often give presentations here to West Australians who were around at the time, and whereas they knew there were Americans here, they knew very little, if anything at all, about what went on in the submarine base. In the words of one of those locals, who said in 1945, after the demobilisation of the base, the Yanks took everything with them. They only left the nails in the floorboards. In Albany, for the whole period that the submarines were in Albany, from March to October 1942, there isn't one mention in the local paper, the Albany Advertiser, of the presence of the submarines. So what is it that brought them to WA? Now, as far as this presentation is concerned, I'll be concentrating primarily on the USN story, as quite clearly it is that story which dominates. Let's recap and see where we were back in those dark days of early 1942. I'll see if I can switch on this laser pointer. I think I've got it. I hope you can see it. Following the destruction of the submarine base at Cavite in the Philippines and the loss of Corregidor, the American Asiatic submarine fleet was in dire straits. They had to leave, and not importantly, they also left their entire stock of torpedoes at the submarine base, because there was just no time to move them off the Philippines. So the submarine tenders USS Holland and Otis first off shifted to Surabaya, number 1 in the map here, but they found that quite unsuitable because, of course, the onslaught of the Japanese, and particularly their almost unopposed air power, meant that they couldn't work during the day. They had to dive the submarines if they were in maintenance during the day, sit them on the harbour floor, and then surface at night and do the work on them. There was also the administrative problem, is that the Dutch didn't work on weekends, which was a bit of a problem for the American war effort, and indeed their own. They then moved, that was untenable, they moved temporarily to Cilacap on the southern coast of Java. That was also totally unsuitable. It was the head of a very long river, and the Japanese soon learned that the Japanese were there, and they were beset with the same problems they had with Surabaya. So on the 20th of February 42, the USS Holland set sail for Exmouth Gulf, where they thought they'd try that out. Of course, they did anchor there, and some of the submarines berthed with Holland, but they found that it was quite clearly unsuitable, given its remoteness from any industrial infrastructure. However, they did later on actually put a fueling depot there in the latter periods of the war, 44, 45, to save submarines coming all the way back to Fremantle to fuel. So the move then became from from Exmouth to Fremantle. Of course, that was a very dark time for the population. The future looked very bleak, given the speed of the Japanese advance. Following the bombing of Darwin, Broome and Wyndham, the population of Western Australia felt extremely vulnerable. Indeed, they were hard at work. So the small towns of Perth and Fremantle were preparing for an invasion, but it wasn't the invasion that they really thought was going to happen. The invasion was from an equally overwhelming force. It was the arrival of the Americans in great quantity. And here's a picture of the Colonial Mutual Life building in St George's Terrace. Those of natives of Western Australia of the past would recognise that building maybe, and that's where the Southwest Command set up their headquarters. There was, of course, when the Americans arrived, a collective sigh of relief. There was no doubt that the population of Perth and Fremantle were so frightened of what was happening that they saw the Americans as saviours. And as you can see from the pictures there, some of the younger women felt that they were more than saviours, that they became part of their fabric of their lives. But the gloom was that despite the sense of relief brought by the arrival of the Americans, the reality was that they were in very bad shape. All they had was the USS Holland and the submarines. They had nothing in the way of infrastructure, etc. at that stage, and if the Japanese threat had continued to come south, they would have simply had to move on, perhaps even to New Zealand, as one retired admiral said in one of the quotes. But in a sense, they did move on. They chose actually to split the force in case the Japanese, particularly their air power, came any further south, to split the submarine force between Fremantle and Albany. And the submarines were at Albany from the March of 42 through to October of the same year. Of course, while they were there, they almost overwhelmed and outnumbered the local population of Albany in 1942. And once again, the local population, particularly the younger women, welcomed the arrival of the Americans. But here to the real title of the presentation, Iron Men and Tin Fish. The reason I chose that is that someone wrote a book about it, as you can see from the cover there, but it aptly describes the problems that the Americans had in the first months of the Pacific War, because they had very few successes against enemy shipping, despite very aggressive patrolling of the enemy invasion and resupply routes in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies theatres. And the main reason appeared to be the submarine's main offensive weapon, which was the Mark 14 torpedo. Frustrated by that, in May of 42, the Commander Submarine Southwest Pacific then, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, when he greeted the CO of USS Skipjack, Lieutenant Commander Red Coe, USN, he was debriefed in the following words by Red Coe: to make a round trip of 8,500 miles to gain an attack position undetected within 800 yards of enemy ships only to find that the torpedoes run deep and over half the time fail to explode, seems to me to be an undesirable manner of gaining information which might be determined on any morning within a few miles of a torpedo station in the presence of comparatively few hazards. Coe's persuasive and detailed analysis confirmed reports from other commanding officers and galvanised Lockwood into action. Contacting the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, Lockwood received the startling reply that the problems lay not with the Mark 14 torpedo, but instead stemmed from the deficiencies in aptitude of the captains and their crews. Lockwood's immediate reaction to this can be imagined, but is unfortunately not recorded. What is recorded, that is his feeling of being abandoned by Buord, and he resolved to get to the bottom of the issue himself. So his Chief of Staff, then Captain James Fife, rolled up his sleeves and designed an unsophisticated series of trials that would have Red Coe and Skipjack fire a series of properly weighted test torpedoes at a fishing net strung across Frenchman's Bay at Albany on the 20th of June 1942. Following the firings, measurement of the holes made in the nets showed that the torpedoes ran 11 feet deeper than set, too far below a target's keel for the magnetic trigger to fire. Buord responded with the comment that these were hardly scientific tests and that Lockwood should cease wasting scarce torpedoes. Undeterred, Lockwood had the trials repeated by USS Soro on the 18th of July with identical results. These results succeeded in disrupting the bureaucratic calm within Buord, which was forced to conduct its own tests on the 1st of August of 1942. And, oops, you can guess the result. They found the same problem. What was the problem? Well, for those familiar with basic fluid mechanics, you would have heard of Mr. Bernoulli, and he was found to be the major culprit. The investigations revealed that the depth sensor port, the way in which it was placed, allowed Bernoulli to be controlling the depth, because the faster the torpedo went, the shallower it thought it was, and the deeper it would go to seek out what it thought was the correct pressure for the set depth. They fixed that, and of course the lesson of that story is to listen to the men and women at the sharp end. And the post-war, of course, lesson is that those trials at the small port of Albany and the submarine operations from all the submarine bases around the Pacific had a fundamentally and crucial effect on the outcome of the war in the Pacific. So well done, Albany. So with their faith restored in the weapon, the Americans started to renew the war with renewed vigour, and with that they started to get immediate successes. So what is the submarine repair unit or the submarine base in Fremantle? The immediate task when they arrived in March of 1942 was an urgent need for docking facilities. Now, the civilian slipway, which many of you will be familiar with and still exists, it's got ovens on at the moment, was only partially completed as the lack of divers had been and machinery had been diverted to other areas of the national response to the war. So the Lieutenant Commander Jones of the USN Constructor Force managed to complete the slipway using divers from USS Holland and the electric motors from a badly damaged Dutch submarine which had arrived and was judged as unsuitable to repair for operations. Work on that slipway was completed by September 1942, and in 1943 a larger floating dock arrived from the US because by that stage the submarines were predominantly the larger fleet submarines. Here's a map of Perth. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Perth, but we've got Fremantle at the bottom left and the city of Perth at the top right. Was the network which was the submarine repair unit was quite wide. It extended from Northam some 100 miles to 100 kilometres to the east of Perth through to Fremantle. Why Northam? That was where one of the naval armament depots was set up by the Americans. So the war-shot torpedoes were stored there. Then they were brought down to the torpedo workshop in Subiaco, quite close to the Perth CBD, where they were prepped. Moved down to the wharf near where HMAS Lewin used to be, now Lewin Barracks, and then was shipped down to the submarines at the actual repair base, which was at the North Wharf in Fremantle Harbour, about here. The base consisted of the 2 submarine tenders, all of the nested submarines that happened to be there, and as I said, there was a floating dock from 1943. Quite a good range of workshops, as shown on that slide. I won't go through them all, and of course the slipway. Local industry was part of the network, and so there were all of the requirements of a sophisticated submarine maintenance facility were all covered by local industry, foundries, even carpentry shops, boat builders for internal repairs, galvanising, steel pipework shops, etc., etc., etc. Essentially, the base was manned by 32 officers and about 1,000 men. It varied from time to time, but that was one of the accounts that I've used in this presentation. I should add that in the extracts from the report to Congress of the United States Naval Administration in World War II, the submarine commands, then Vice Admiral Lockwood and Vice Admiral Fife commented that the Perth Fremantle area was generally conceded as the finest basing area of any US submarines operating from the Pacific during the war. So that was quite a considerable achievement by the Americans and the locals. Of course, they had to live somewhere, and the base personnel were permanently based in what used to be the old insane asylum in Fremantle. That was the main barracks, and it was also the area for transit as well, and that accommodated up to 600 or 700 people at any one time. Some of the enlisted men had to bunk down at the various warehouses where they were operating from, and as I said, the submarine repair unit on North Wharf itself, there's a variation in the numbers there. I'd said before about 36 officers, I think, but now this one says 60, but that was the account at the time that was written. And of course, the slipway building had a small barracks area next to it. I think it was hammocks accommodation for the submarines that were actually on the slipway at the time. Of course, R&R for the submarine crews between patrols was very important and quite sophisticated. And unfortunately, as the way the Americans do it, was quite restrictive on the local population. Officers had a number of private houses in the plush suburbs of Perth, the western suburbs. Some of the hotels on the river as well, and the enlisted men had also houses both within Perth, Fremantle, and the area south of Perth, down towards Waterman's Bay and even down to what is now Safety Bay sort of area. The hotels were the problem for the locals, because once the Americans settled into them, they were off bounds for the locals. Although I'm sure that the Americans found way for the queue of young women who wanted to enjoy their company. Popular one, of course, was the Ocean Beach Hotel in Cottesloe, as it is today. The way in which the US authorities within Fremantle dealt with the returning submariners after their usually 90-day patrol was that invariably they were met by the pilot boat at Rottnest Island, and the pilot boat would have on board the mail for that submarine, urns of fresh milk and cartons of fresh fruit. And on the way in, they ate, drank and read mail. And when they got in, they saw the doctor, they saw the dentist, and then went to the wet canteen, and in the words of one, proceeded to get stoned, which I guess is what they deserved from their time at sea. Again, in the report to Congress by Vice Admirals Lockwood and Fife was the added comment that up on the screen there, which is his words: "The gracious hospitality and genuine appreciation shown submariners by the population of Perth made rest periods in this area easily the most enjoyable experience by submariners at any Pacific base." And I guess this one young man probably sums up their feelings. At 18, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. The Americans, of course, were not alone, at least from 1944. As we know, the sun never set on the British Empire, and we were part of the British Empire. Some would say that the sun never set on the British Empire, but because God didn't trust the Brits in the dark. But then we'll leave that for now and perhaps talk about that later. But from September 1944, there was a squadron of 10 British and Dutch submarines arrived with the depot ship Maidstone. Of course, the Brit submarines, they'd come mainly from Colombo, were smaller, shorter, probably totally unsuitable for the conditions given their lack of any form of air conditioning. But nonetheless, they did some very good work. They were used a lot in insertion and extraction activities in the northern areas of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, but they also had some very noteworthy successes, some of which you may be familiar with. The first one was HMS Trenchant, which was based in Fremantle from September 44. She was on patrol when the intelligence found that the Japanese cruiser Ashishiga was in his area, and he was instructed to go and see if he could intercept it. He did. He fired at it a salvo of 8 Mark 8 torpedoes and had 5 hits. Remarkably, according to the CO of the time, it was the first time they'd successfully fired a full salvo of 8 torpedoes, and so they were very pleased with that. It was a record-making attack because it was reported as being the largest warship, I should say, sunk by an Allied submarine at any period during the First World War. Now, I haven't checked on that, but that was the assertion in the documents that I read. The Dutch submarine Zwaardvis had an intercept with a German submarine, U-168. Now, U-168 was crossing the Java Sea and decided, with German efficiency, to alert the local Japanese units in accordance with established procedure of its departure and arrival, intended course and speed, which was very helpful to the decryptors at Fremantle, who then said, that's very interesting, we've got a Dutch submarine in the area. And so the Zwaardvis intercepted the U-168 and sank it. She didn't sink immediately, so there were some 27 survivors which were taken captive, and some useful intelligence was gained from them. Not so remarkable was the experience of the Dutch submarine 019, which I guess maybe they thought it was an uncharted reef, but they had a spectacular ending, best forgotten, when they went hard aground on a reef in northern Australia. A US submarine was sent to assist, but after many attempts of trying to rock the boat, moving water fore and aft, by doing all sorts of things, they decided, or the Americans decided, to tell the Dutch, get off, we're about to first fire a torpedo at you, and then we're going to use some gunnery practice to get her in a state where we can just slide her off the reef. And that's what happened to the Dutch submarine 019. I guess any story of the submarine effort here in Fremantle and Perth isn't complete without the record of how well or how bad the men that served performed. Of course, no criticism of their seagoing performance, and of course all sailors were usually high-spirited when they were ashore and they were well liked in Perth and Fremantle. But there were some later problems, one of which was known as the Battle of Fremantle, and I guess there was some sense of the old overpaid, oversexed and over here sense while the Aussie boys were fighting in the north. But there were a number of quite serious conflicts, one of which arose when added to the recipe of some of the locals, particularly returning Australian servicemen, not being too friendly toward the American servicemen. Added into that mix was a troop ship full of Kiwis, and we all know how the Kiwis like a bit of a stoush, and there was what was called the Battle of Fremantle, which ended in the deaths of two American servicemen, and that just inflamed the issue. And reports of the day was that in both Perth and Fremantle there was just a free-for-all of 500 or 600 people at once, all just at that stage fighting for the sake of fighting. So finally, of course, the war was over. The picture here I show you is of one of the American submarines with some Japanese captives. During the latter stages of 1944 and particularly into 45, there were no real targets for the American submarines and the British and the Dutch submarines in the sense of tankers and large merchant ships, because most of them were at the bottom already by that stage. So the Americans did most of their patrolling on the surface. The Japanese air power was no longer a threat, and so we did most of the actions were by gun action amongst much smaller craft, and usually they were manned by Japanese, and almost invariably once they were bailed up and they abandoned ship, in order to disguise who might be an officer and an enlisted person, they removed their clothes before jumping over and being saved by the Americans, which was quite a remarkable sight, I believe, of all these naked Japanese clambering over the side of American submarines. But they had prepared for that because they got used to it, and they had lots of potato sacks on board, which they turned into new uniforms for the Japanese submarine prisoners. So what was the result? Well, it's quite clear there that the record shows that the submarines out of Fremantle accounted for 409,000 or nearly 410,000 tonnes of Japanese tanker shipping. and well over half of the entire United States submarine effort. Also, in the sinking of escort vessels by United States submarines, the record there shows that Fremantle-based submarines did extremely well as well. Of course, a lot of that was that the reason for that, of course, they were a hell of a lot closer to the areas of Dutch East Indies and South China Sea, the Philippines, than most of the other larger submarine bases. War patrols, similarly, the numbers were quite high from Fremantle. Total of 1,500 odd war patrols conducted during the entire war, and some 350 odd were conducted from Fremantle. Of course, it was not without cost. Of 11 submarines and their submariners operating from Fremantle are in what the submarine parlance would call still on patrol. That's the record there of United States submarines lost on patrol in the Pacific. Quite high for Fremantle, given its also its high success rate as well. I said earlier that the Yanks took everything and they only left the nails in the floorboards, according to one, but they even took a lot of women home with them. And thankfully, a lot of those later in the post-war period emigrated back to Australia, many of whom settled in WA. Regrettably, although there are some of their progeny still in WA, there are none of the original wives or widows and families remaining in WA. A little bit of advertisement here now. Of course, none of this has gone unobserved by the submariners of the day today, the Australian submariners, who recognise the heritage aspects of what there is in Fremantle there, and some of the facilities, although different, but they're still there from those days. So the Submarine Institute of Australia has a project whereby it's establishing a Australian National Submarine Museum, which will be a museum of known assets across the country, all tied together by a website which will explain the history of anything to do with submarines and the heritage within Australia over its record of use of submarines since the First World War. I chair a committee here in Perth, which is the Submarine Heritage Project or committee, the intent of which is to make sure that all of those assets which are still there are recognised in a proper heritage and conservation manner. That work, of course, is ongoing. This is a picture of what I'm sort of talking about. That yellow area there is the area that still exists. This is the area next to the West Australian Maritime Museum, the big building there. The odd shape just there, for those that don't know, is the height of the building had to be such that it could get the mast height of the yacht Australia 2 into the museum. But the slipway still exists, as do the cranes. That's Ovens, the Submarine Museum. That's part of the West Australian Maritime Museum now. The old winch house, etc. There was some thought during last year, people were panicking a bit that things looked a bit fragile on the slipway. That what would happen if there was an earthquake and the submarine fell off the blocks and all this sort of stuff. And well, we thought, well, earthquakes happen, but nonetheless, some strengthening was carried out of the support areas, and all the wheels were welded to the railway. All the bogies were welded to the to the rails to ensure that the submarine was not going to move. These buildings here, although they look fairly new, are part of the area that supported the slipway during the Second World War. Regrettably, bureaucracy takes over because that area there is the West Australian Maritime Museum, but this area here belongs to someone completely different. So it makes things a little bit complicated. So that's an ongoing project, an important one. It's taking time because, well, that's bureaucracy, I guess. I'll just let you have a look at that before I go to the final. This is all about submarine communications. And thank you very much.